Papin sisters. The brutal murder of the Lancelin family in the 1930s, a morbid murder case, shocked the French. The Papin sisters killed and maimed their employer and her daughter in the house where they worked. The sisters Christine and Leah Papin entered history with a heinous crime that caused revulsion among the French. On the eve of February 2, 1933, a cold winter night, they killed and disfigured a mother and daughter. As soon as they reached the age of majority, Christine and Leah left home and found a source of income for them to live together: housework. They were hired by the couple René and Léonie Lancelin, elderly residents of Le Mans. However, Chris and Leah were considerably strange in their behavior. Most of the days they were secluded in some corner, quiet and concentrated among themselves. Afterwards, it was alleged that the sisters had a sexual relationship with each other. In general, they did not speak to the boss during the 7 years of work. It was Léonie, who was passionate about the impeccable cleanliness of the house, who communicated with the Papins. On the day of the murder, Léonie and Geneviève were returning from an afternoon walk and found the house very dark. It turns out that the fuse has dropped due to the use of an iron, in a way that has happened before. However, the technician called for the repair did not report any faults in the machine, causing the costs of the professional to fall on Christine and Leah. Things got ugly from there. This is because the whole situation made Madame Léonie very angry, as one of the sisters later testified. Troubled by the iron issue, the lady chafed at the Papin sisters. The situation escalated and culminated in Christine hitting her mistress over the head with a heavy jug. Geneviève then went after Christine to protect her mother. Chris then reacted by attacking his daughter's eyes. As it turned out, the older sister instructed the younger one to gouge out Léonie's eyes. Hours later, Boss René came home and broke into the entrance, invading it with the police. In shock, he found his wife and daughter mutilated and bloodied on the floor. Meanwhile, the sisters were safe and sound, naked, in the bedroom. As soon as the police found them, they admitted to the crime, showing no remorse. Afterwards, at the hearing, the sisters were unable to explain the act. With the investigations, it was concluded that the two succumbed to the condition of a folie à deux, madness of two, a shared and feedback psychosis, generating paranoia, hearing voices, exaggerated self-defense, and unusual sexual behaviors. Most likely, the psychosis was triggered by the anger expressed by Madame Lancelin. Another factor raised was the fact that Christine always dominated the relationship between the sisters, while Leah was absolutely submissive. Christine was initially sentenced to death, but the sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. Leah Papin received a 10-year sentence as an accessory to the crime. The case was accompanied by big names in France at the time, such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, who claimed to be a case of crisis in the class struggle. How was the crime of the Papin sisters? The story takes place in the city of Le Mans, in the interior of France, where the 28-year-old older sister Christine was already working, who lived with the family of a lawyer, with his wife and daughter. After some time, her sister Leah, 21 years old, introduces herself to her boss and is accepted for the job. The mistress receives her at home, considering that there were advantages in this hiring, not least because they would occupy the same room. The two stayed, after the daily services, in the boss's attic. The sisters had a period of their education in an orphanage run by nuns, where they learned discipline and work done with great quality, which pleased the mistress, who was very demanding in terms of cleanliness. Christine and her other sister were sent to an orphanage during their childhood, managed by the nuns. Leah, her mother's favorite, continued with her, causing Christine to revolt against her own mother for abandoning her. The relationship between the maids and the bosses had a certain air of mystery, as they did not communicate through speech. Christine, as an older sister, always putting herself as the protector of the younger one, gradually shows a controlling behavior over her. One night, after an incident with an iron and afraid of their mistress's reaction when they returned home and saw their clothes burned, the sisters, almost in panic, took refuge in their room, waiting for their mistress to arrive to speak of what happened. On the return of the mistress and her daughter, where she observes what happened, she goes to the attic and, through words full of hate, starts a discussion with Christine and, when she refers to her sister Leah, in an irrational impetus and anger, the murders happen suddenly. The sisters, as if taken by something stronger than themselves, kill their mistress and daughter, using tools, and commit the greatest atrocities during the murders. After what happened, the authorities find them together in her room, in her bed, naked. To Dr. Georges Dumas, with respectful affection. We recall the horrific circumstances of the Le Mans massacre and the emotion which the mystery of the motives of the two murderers, the sisters Christine and Leah Papin, aroused in the public conscience. This concern, this interest, was answered by the press with very broad information on the facts, through the most intelligent intelligence in the field of journalism. Here, then, we will do no more than summarize the facts of the crime. The two sisters, one 28 and the other 21, have worked for several years as servants in a bourgeois house in the small provincial town, home to a lawyer, wife and daughter. Bread cooks, it was said, excellent workers, enviés au ménage. Thus, if it is observed that the conductors seem to have been strangely lacking in human sympathy, there is nothing to say that the haughty indifference of the servants merely corresponded to this attitude. From one group to another, they were not spoken. This silence, however, could not be empty, even if it was dark in the eyes of the actors. On the 2nd of February, at dusk, this darkness materializes due to a trivial domestic electricity blackout. The decomposition was provoked by a clumsiness on the part of the sisters, and the absent patrons have already shown, over insignificant trifles, very vivid reactions of humor. What did the mother and daughter say when they returned to find the common mess? Christine's responses varied on this point. In any case, the drama is unleashed very quickly and, in the form of the attack, it is difficult to admit another version than the one given by the correlative defects of classical descriptions and explanations made the basic existence of such variations unavoidable, asserting the stability of paranoid delusions, when the only thing that exists is the constancy of structure. This conception leads specialists to conclusions erroneous and explains their difficulties, their embarrass, in the presence of numerous paranoid crimes, in which their sense of reality breaks down, despite their doctrines, but does not generate in them anything. Uncertainty. In the case of the Papin sisters, we must consider the only trace of a pre-criminal formulation of delusional ideas as a complement to the clinical picture, if we know that we find it mainly in the testimony of the Central Commissioner of the city. Its inaccuracy could in no way be a reason to reject it. Every psychiatrist knows the very special atmosphere often evoked because one does not know what stereotype these patients' words are, even before they are enunciated in delusional formulas. It is enough for someone to have experienced this impression only once for him not to have contemptible recognition of it. However, the selection functions of police centers are usual, donnant el habitude, from this experience. In prison, Christine expresses various delusional issues. We therefore qualify not only certain typical symptoms of delirium, such as the systematic ignorance of reality. Christine asks how her two victims are, they comment if they introduce themselves, and declares that they believe they are reincarnated in other bodies, but also the most ambiguous beliefs, which translate into expressions like this one: "I think in another life I should be my sister's husband." In phrases like these, in fact, you can recognize contents that are very typical of classified delusions. Furthermore, it is constant to find some ambivalence in all delusional beliefs, from the more calmly affirmative forms of fantastical delusions, in which the subject nevertheless recognizes a double reality, to the interrogative forms of delusions called assumption. In those every assertion of reality is suspect. In our case, the analysis of these contents and forms would allow us to specify the place of the two sisters in the natural classification of delusions. The Papin sisters could not place themselves in that very limited form of paranoia that, through such formal correlations, we isolated our work, in the Amy case. They would probably move away from the generic frames of paranoia to enter paraphrenia, which Kreplin's genius defined, delimited, as immediately contiguous forms. This diagnostic precision, in the chaotic state of our information, would, however, be very precarious. Furthermore, it would be of little use for our study of crime motives, since, as we indicated in our work, the forms of paranoia and the neighboring delusional forms remain united by a community of structure that justifies the application of the same methods of analysis. The truth is that the forms of psychosis are shown to us in the two sisters, if not identical, then at least closely correlated. The startling assertion that it was impossible for two beings to be simultaneously affected by the same madness or, on the contrary, to reveal it at the same time, was heard in the course of the debates. It is a completely false statement. Duet delusions, délires à deux, are among the most recognized forms of psychosis. Observations show that they are produced electively between close relatives, father and son, mother and daughter, brothers or sisters. Let's say that its mechanism highlights in certain cases the contingent suggestion exerted by an active delusional subject on a passive and weak subject. Let's see that our conception of paranoia gives a completely different notion and explains more satisfactorily the criminal parallelism of the two sisters. The homicidal drive that we conceive as the basis of paranoia would, in fact, be nothing more than an unsatisfactory abstraction if it were not controlled by a series of correlative anomalies of socialized instincts, and if the present state of our knowledge of personality evolution did not allow us to consider these instinctual anomalies. Sisters, namely, that it was sudden, simultaneous, and brought suddenly to the paroxysm of fury. Each one takes possession of an adversary, takes his eyes out of their sockets, unheard of, as it were, in the annals of crime, and then finishes him off. Then, with the help of everything within reach, a hammer, a tin jug, a kitchen knife, they rage over the dead bodies of their victims, smash their faces, and, taking them out of their sex, stab deep into the thighs and the buttocks of one to rub the thighs and buttocks of the other with that blood. They immediately wash the instruments of these atrocious rites, purify themselves and lie down on the same bed. This is the formula they exchange and which seems to set the tone of disincarnation, destruction, emptied of all emotion, what happens in them to the orgy of blood. The judge will not give him any understandable reason for his act, no hatred, no wrong against his victims. Your only concern will seem to be sharing all the responsibility for the crime. Before three specialist doctors will be shown no delirium, no dementia, no current psychic or physical disorder, and they will be required to record this fact. At the bottom of the crime, there are some data that are too inaccurate, apparently, to be taken into account: the incoherent efforts of the sisters before the mayor to obtain the emancipation of the youngest sister, a general secretary who found them crazy, Peaks, a central commissioner who testifies that he considered himself persecuted. There is also the unique bond, their immunity to any other interest, the rest days they spend together and in their room. But has anyone hitherto been disturbed by such oddities? It also omitted information about a brutal alcoholic father, who would have raped one of his daughters, as well as the early abandonment of her education. After 5 months in prison, Christine, isolated from her sister, has a fit of violent agitation, with terrifying hallucinations. During another crisis he tries to remove his eyes, without success of course, but not without injury. The furious agitation makes it necessary this time to use the straitjacket. Erotic displays are given, symptoms of melancholy appear, depression, refusal of food, self-accusation, expiatory acts of a disgusting character. Later, on several occasions, he released phrases of delusional meaning. Christine claimed to have simulated one of these states. Let's say, however, that this statement cannot in any way be considered as the true key to its nature. The feeling of play is generally experienced in such states by the subject, without its behavior therefore being less typically morbid. On September 30th, the sisters are sentenced by the jury. Christine, hearing that her head will be cut off in place demands, receives this news on her knees. However, the characteristics of the crime, Christine's ruptures in prison, the strangeness of the sisters' lives, convinced most psychiatrists of the killer's irresponsibility. Faced with the refusal of a counter-expert, Dr. Loger, whose highly qualified personality is well known, decided to appear before the court as a defense attorney. Was the rule of rigor inherent to the masterful clinician, or was prudence imposed by circumstances that placed him in the position of a lawyer? The fact is that Dr. Loger advanced not one, but several hypotheses about the alleged mental anomaly of the sisters: persecutory ideas, sexual perversion, epilepsy, or hysteropelvy. If we believe that we can formulate a more unequivocal explanation of the problem, we want to pay homage to its authority, not only because it protects us from the censure of issuing a diagnosis without having personally examined the patients, but also because it has sanctioned formulas that are particularly successful in isolating certain very delicate facts, and yet, as we shall see, essential to the demonstration of our thesis. In their genesis: homosexuality, sadistic masochistic perversion, such are the drive disorders whose existence, in this case, only psychoanalysts were able to detect and whose genetic significance we have tried to show in our work. It must be confessed that the Papin sisters seem to contribute to these correlations a conformation that could be described as rude. Sadism is evident in the manipulations, maneuvers, performed on the victims, and what meaning do they take, in the light of these data, the exclusive affection of the two sisters, the mystery of their lives, the rarities of their cohabitation, their fearful approach, their rapprochement peureux, in the same bed after the crime? Our experience with these sick people makes us hesitate, however, before the affirmation, launched by some, K. Dawkins Franchisant, of the reality of the sexual relations between the sisters. That's why we thank Dr. Loger for the subtlety of the term, psychological partner, that gives the measure of his reserve on this issue. Psychoanalysts themselves, when they derive paranoia from homosexuality, call this unconscious homosexuality, larvus. This homosexual tendency would only be expressed by a mad denial, éperdu, which would establish the conviction of being persecuted and designate the beloved in the persecutor. But what is this singular tendency which, being so close to its most evident revelation, will always remain separated from it by a singularly transparent obstacle?